Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're really digging into something fundamental. How money, how economic incentives can shape the science that policymakers end up relying on.
It's a critical question.
Yeah, we're looking at how biases, baked into funding or institutional structures can filter all the way up from basic research into big policy decisions.
And lead to some pretty bad outcomes, potentially, like harvesting way too much of something, or maybe not enough.
Exactly. We're diving deep into a paper called Research Agendas for Profitable Invasive Species. It's by Melina Kourantidou and Brooks A. Kaiser, published back in 2019.
And what's really striking about this area is how vulnerable applied economics can be. Think about bioeconomics. It really leans heavily on biology, on ecology evidence.
Right.
But what happens if that basic science is, uncertain or contradictory, or worse, systematically biased, depending on who's funding it or who's doing it?
Then the policy advice is built on shaky ground.
Especially for natural resources, yeah. The recommendations are definitely at risk.
So our mission today is to unpack that mechanism. It's not just like a conspiracy theory. It's about how the frameworks themselves, the institutions, might steer how knowledge gets produced. We really want to understand what happens when a species is both, an ecological disaster and a massive cash cow.
And that's the beauty of this paper's case study. The authors deliberately picked a situation where the economic incentives were really pulling in opposite directions.
Like a natural experiment for bias.
Exactly. Sets up the test perfectly.
Okay, so let's get into their specific case. The Barents Sea red king crab, RKC for short.
Right.
This creature is sort of the perfect storm for this kind of analysis, isn't it? It's a hugely profitable fishery,
Big money involved.
but also an invasive species that really tears up the ecosystem.
Yeah, the history here is key to understanding the conflict. This crab isn't native to the Barents Sea at all.
No.
Soviet scientists deliberately introduced it near Murmansk. This was back in the 1960s.
And the goal was purely economic.
Purely economic. They wanted to establish a new commercial fishery. And, well, they succeeded. Maybe a bit too well. Because the crabs started spreading west into Norwegian waters, starting around the late 70s.
Okay, so you've got the country that introduced it for profit, Russia, and the country that basically received it as like an unwanted ecological guest, Norway.
Precisely. That polarization is what makes this such a good test case.
And their management styles today reflect that history.
Totally different. Russia, largely, treats it as a valuable resource. They have this big, offshore, kind of monopolized fishery.
Right. Profit-focused.
Norway, though, has this sort of split personality about it. They do have a coastal fishery, mainly for local profits. But, and this is crucial, since 2008, they've also had this open access fishery further west.
And the point of that one is?
Eradication. Stop the spread.
Yeah.
They really don't want it moving further down their coast.
Wow. Okay, so that sets up a really clear expectation for the research, doesn't it?
It does. You'd expect Russian research, at least initially, to focus on the positive stuff, how big the stock is, how much can be harvested.
The commercially useful information.
While Norway, facing the invasion front, you'd expect them to be more focused on the downsides, the ecological damage.
What kind of damage are we talking about? What were the main uncertainties the research looked at?
Well, there are two broad categories. First, the basics. How many crabs are there? Stock estimates, age structure, that kind of thing. Standard fisheries science.
Okay.
But the second category, and this is where the incentives really bite, is the ecological impact. How does the Barents Sea ecosystem actually respond to this newcomer?
Like what it eats or what it destroys.
Exactly. What damage does it do to the seabed, the benthic habitat, and what's its impact on other valuable species, like cod or halibut? That's often the least understood part.
Now, to analyze how these different incentives might be influencing the science, the authors talk about institutional structure. They use terms like vertical and horizontal integration. Can you break that down? Why does that matter?
Yeah, it sounds a bit jargony, but think of it like this. Vertical integration is basically when the same organization does both the research and makes the policy recommendations based on that research.
Like marking your own homework, as you said.
Kind of, yeah. So in this case, you have institutes like the Institute of Marine Research, the IMR in Norway, or PNRO in Russia. They do the science, and they advise their governments.
And the risk is?
The risk is it can close off informational input, as the authors put it. It can reinforce existing biases within that national system. if an institute gets a lot of its prestige or even funding based on the success of the fishery.
Then the research might consciously or unconsciously lean towards supporting that fishery.
It creates a potential silo, exactly,
Yeah.
where the institutional goals, whether profit or eradication, get reflected back in the research they produce and prioritize.
Okay, so that's vertical. What about horizontal integration?
That's the opposite. It's about connections across different groups, sharing data, collaborating,
Like scientists talking to each other across disciplines?
or, crucially here, across borders, like Norwegian and Russian scientists working together, sharing data openly, maybe challenging each other's findings.
So a lack of horizontal integration means less cooperation, less cross-checking.
Right. It makes it easier for those vertically integrated silos to just reinforce their own perspectives without outside challenge.
Got it. So how did the authors actually test for bias in the research output? What was their method?
They did a pretty extensive literature review. They looked at 42 different impact studies published between 1998 and 2017.
Peer-reviewed stuff.
Both peer-reviewed papers and also internal reports, what's sometimes called gray literature. They ended up cataloging 89 specific findings or observations about how the crabs interact with the environment.
And how do you statistically compare findings from different studies that might be looking at slightly different things?
Yeah, a formal meta-analysis wasn't really possible because the studies weren't directly comparable, so they used logistic regression. They basically built a statistical model to predict the probability that any given study would report finding a negative impact from the crab.
And what factors did they test against that probability?
Key things like the nationality of the primary author, which they call the research environment, basically Norway or Russia. Also, what the study was actually focused on the study purpose and the year it was published to see if things changed over time.
Let's talk about those study purpose categories. They use studies looking at damage to the seabed, the benthic ecosystem, as their baseline for comparison, right? Why that one?
That's a really important choice. Benthic impacts like loss of worms, algae, general biodiversity on the seafloor, these things don't really have a direct, easily calculated market value.
You can't really sell seabed health on the open market.
Exactly. So the thinking is, research focused, there should be, in theory, the least influenced by direct commercial pressures related to the crab fishery itself.
So it acts as a kind of neutral baseline.
A less commercially conflicted baseline, yeah. They could then compare findings from that category to studies looking at things with more obvious economic links, like whether the crabs were eating commercially important fish.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. What did the numbers actually show? What did the regression find about the influence of, say, Russian authorship versus Norwegian?
Well, the main finding was pretty stark. It strongly suggested that achieving scientific consensus is much harder when you have these kinds of polarized economic incentives pulling research in different directions.
And the specific number for Russian authorship?
It was striking.
Yeah.
The model found that if a study's primary author was Russian, it was significantly less likely to report finding negative impacts on the crab invasion.
How much less likely?
The odds ratio was incredibly low, 0.00003, and it was highly statistically significant.
Wait, 0.0003. For listeners not used to odds ratios, what does that mean in plain English? Like orders of magnitude less likely?
It means the odds of a Russian-led study finding negative impacts were thousands of times lower compared to the baseline studies focused on benthic damage. It's a massive difference.
Thousands, that's huge.
It is. It strongly suggests a systematic difference in the research findings coming out of the two national systems, aligning almost perfectly with their different economic stakes in the crab. The country that introduced it for profit just wasn't producing much research highlighting the problems.
That's incredible. But you mentioned there was also a time trend. Did the gap close over the years?
Yes and no. Overall, looking at all studies from 1998 to 2017, the general likelihood of reporting negative impacts actually decreased over time.
So overall, science became less negative about the crab.
It seems that way. But here's the twist. The really interesting part came from an interaction term in their model. It showed that this decrease over time was almost entirely driven by changes in Norwegian research.
Not Russian.
Russian research stayed consistently unlikely to report negative impacts throughout the period. It was the Norwegian studies that became progressively less likely to find negative impacts as time went on.
Wow. So what does that suggest?
It suggests that Norway's initial focus on the ecological downsides, which you'd expect from the country being invaded, seemed to erode over time.
As the fishery became more profitable for them too.
That's the strong implication. As Norway started developing its own valuable fishery from the crab, Its research agenda appeared to shift. It started focusing less on the ecological damage and perhaps more on aspects supporting commercial exploitation. The research seemed to follow the money.
So the gap closed because Norway started to look more like Russia in its research focus.
In terms of reporting negative ecological impacts, yes, that's what the trend suggests. The authors also found some qualitative evidence supporting this. For instance, within Norway's IMR, research funding started leaning more heavily towards commercial aspects, like stock assessments, compared to funding for studying those diffuse, non-market ecological impacts.
The research dollars literally followed the potential profit margin.
It certainly looks that way.
Okay, so we have this evidence of systematic bias potentially linked to economic incentives. What does this mean for actually managing the resource? The paper talks about type I and type 2 errors.
Right, and this is where the policy implications get serious. A type I error, in this context, means you incorrectly dismiss the idea that the crab is causing significant negative harm.
So you assume it's basically, okay, manage it like a regular fishery, let it spread.
Exactly. You bet on the profits. The authors argue this could be the most costly error in terms of overall social welfare, because you risk potentially huge, maybe irreversible damage to the ecosystem that you didn't account for.
Then the type 2 error.
That's the opposite mistake.
Hmm.
You cling to the idea that it is causing major harm, even if it's not as bad as feared, and you spend resources trying to eradicate it.
So you waste money fighting it and miss out on the fishery profits.
Correct. You lose the economic benefits unnecessarily. There are costs either way. But the potential scale of irreversible ecological damage makes the type I error particularly worrying.
And how does the structure of the research and management, that vertical integration thing, make this worse?
Well, the authors point out that the split in management between Russia and Norway around 2007 actually reduced the beneficial horizontal integration. There was less cooperation, less data sharing.
So they became more siloed.
Exactly. And within each silo, the strong vertical integration research informing policy within the same national institution makes it easier for these biases to become entrenched and self-reinforcing. The research agenda might naturally drift towards maximizing commercial gain within that national system, rather than aiming for an outcome that's truly optimal for everyone, including the environment.
This feels like it has implications way beyond just crabs in the Barents Sea.
Oh, absolutely. This isn't just a fish story. The authors argue this dynamic applies to lots of situations where you have complex trade-offs. Think about other invasive species that are also commercially harvested.
Right, where there's tension between conservation and local economies.
Exactly. Or think about agencies like the U.S. Forest Service trying to manage lands for multiple uses, timber, recreation, conservation, all pulling in different directions.
Mm-hmm.
But the parallel they draw that really hits home is the Colorado River Compact.
Ah, the water allocation issue in the U.S. Southwest.
Right. The initial scientific assessments of how much water the river actually carried, which formed the basis for dividing up the water rights between states back in the 1920s.
They were based on flawed data.
They were based on measurements taken during an unusually wet period. So the average flow used for the allocations was actually much higher than the long-term reality.
And this happened when there was huge pressure to lock in water rights for development.
Precisely. So you had uncertain science combined with strong economic and political incentives. The result was a system that over-allocated the river's water from the very beginning.
And that initial flawed assessment baked into policy created decades of problems downstream, literally.
Exactly. It shows how foundational science, especially when conducted under pressure or with incomplete data, can set policy on a path that's incredibly difficult to correct later, even when the science improves. The initial framing, shaped by incentives, gets locked in.
That's a really powerful comparison. It highlights how high the stakes are for getting the science right and being aware of the pressures on it.
It really does.
Yeah.
So the big takeaway here is that translating research into policy is, well, it's messy, especially when big money is involved. We have to be really critical about where the research questions are coming from, who's funding them, and what the institutional setup looks like. Otherwise, we risk systematically overlooking major environmental risks.
And the authors are upfront about limitations too, right? They mention their analysis is kind of broad strokes, and it's hard to perfectly nail down cause and effect because policy influences future research too.
Yeah, it's a feedback loop. They suggest more work is needed, maybe integrating bibliometric analysis, looking at citation patterns and things like that. And critically, they argue for governance models that actively promote more cross-border scientific cooperation.
Rebuilding that horizontal integration.
Exactly. Trying to break down those national silos.
Okay, so to wrap up, this Red King crab case clearly shows how powerful economic incentives can be, how they can actually shift a nation's entire research focus over time, sometimes away from crucial ecological impacts that just don't have an obvious price tag.
Hmm.
So that leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener. Given this reality, what kind of institutional changes could policymakers put in place right now to make sure that those critical long-term environmental risks, the ones that are hard to value in today's market, don't get pushed aside in future research funding decisions? How do we keep them front and center?